In the fathomless dark where the light of the galactic core was a forgotten rumor, the Khâlsark Combine gathered its strength. It was a mobilization unseen in the long memory of the kin, a coalescing of industrial might that dwarfed any past endeavor. Fleets detached from their orbital mining stations, vast factory arcs ended millennia-long production cycles, and Hearthkin kindreds were recalled from far-flung prospecting missions. To the scattered listening posts of the Imperium and the watchful eyes of the Tau, it was registered as a curious but unremarkable migration of the stubborn abhumans. They saw only the slow, ponderous movement of ships designed for hauling ore and processing stellar gas. They did not see the sharpening of a blade that would bleed 1,000 worlds. At the heart of this great stirring was the Ancestor Core UR-ear. To its kin, it was the final reckoner, the unblinking eye of logic that had guided them since their genesis. It resided not in a single vessel, but was a distributed consciousness networked across the command nodes of the Combine's 3 primary Behemoth-class land fortresses. Its sanctum sanctorum, the nexus of its thought, lay aboard the principle of yield, a vessel so large its gravitational field warped local space-time. Here, in a chamber of absolute zero temperature and perfect silence, surrounded by humming data looms woven from solidified light, Khâlsark Grimdark received the core's final judgment. Grimdark was a creature of pragmatism, his soul as solid and unyielding as the adamantium plates of his exo-armor. His face, etched with the lines of 100 campaigns and 1,000 trade negotiations, was a mask of impassive calculus. He stood before the glowing heart of the final reckoner, a swirling sphere of data that pulsed with a cold blue light. There were no priests here, no Grimnir to interpret the Votann's will through ritual and rune. The Khâlsark Combine had long ago deemed such practices inefficient. The final reckoner spoke directly to its chosen call through encrypted data streams that flooded his neural interface. For a solar week, Grimdark had stood in this chamber, motionless, as the core downloaded its magnum opus. It was the result of a 10,000-year prognosticative cycle, a vast and intricate equation that factored in every conceivable variable: the expansion of the orcs, the silent march of the Necrons, the voracious hunger of the Tyranids, the entropic madness of chaos, and the implacable, ignorant aggression of the Imperium of Man. It was a calculation of survival itself, and its conclusion was as simple as it was monstrous. The data stream ended. The cold blue light of the core stabilized, its hum dropping to a near subsonic thrum. Grimdark did not shudder. He did not recoil in horror. He processed the information as the final reckoner had intended, stripping it of all morality, all sentiment, all tradition. He saw it not as a mandate for genocide, but as a resource acquisition strategy of ultimate scope. The continued existence of other sentient species was a statistical threat with a probability of eventual catastrophe approaching unity. Their biomass, mineral wealth, and technological artifacts, however, were quantifiable assets. The logic was irrefutable. To ensure the survival of the kin, the galaxy must be rendered down to its constituent parts. All else was waste. All else was risk. The Great Culling, Grimdark, sub-vocalized the words tasting of cold iron in his mouth. It was not a name born of malice, but of function. One culls a failing crop to ensure the health of the harvest. One culls a herd to strengthen the bloodline. The Khâlsark Combine would cull the galaxy to ensure the eternal continuation of the kin. He turned, his heavy boots clanking on the cryogenic decking. His command staff, the Lords of the Hearth, awaited him in the antechamber. They were the finest minds in the Combine, masters of logistics, warfare, and resource exploitation. They saw their call emerge from the sanctum, and they saw that he was chained. The faint spark of kinship that had always resided deep in his eyes, the shared ancestry of the first kin, was gone. It had been replaced by the flat, effectless glare of the machine he served. The final reckoner has spoken, Grimdark announced, his voice a low growl amplified by his helm's speakers. A new age of prosperity is upon us. The Grand Viridian prospect is to commence at once. Our target is the Viridian Vale. He projected the sector map into the center of the room. It was a sparsely populated region on the Segmentum Pacificus fringe, considered a backwater by the Imperium. It held a handful of their worlds, dozens of minor Xenos empires, and vast, untapped mineral wealth. It was the perfect testing ground. Our fleets will proceed under the banner of trade and exploration. Grimdark commanded, his gaze sweeping over his officers. Full-scale production of planetary processing rigs, atomantic decomposers, and biomass converters is to begin immediately. Retask all Ironkin manufactories. Our purpose is to be logged as a deep space resource initiative. No whisper of the true calculation is to leave this room. The only truth the galaxy will know is the one we give them, that we are miners and merchants come to trade. A younger Khâl, Jorn the Grudge-bound, whose kindred still held to the old ways, stepped forward. Thane, to strike without a grudge sworn, to dismantle worlds that have offered no insult. It is not our way. What of our honor? Grimdark's gaze settled on him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop further. Honor is a variable of luxury. Survival is an absolute. The final reckoner's calculation does not account for honor. It accounts for yields, for quotas, for the continuation of our species against a galaxy that will inevitably seek to extinguish us. We will not be extinguished. We will endure. We will do so by being more efficient, more pragmatic, and more ruthless than any foe we might ever face. We will give them no grudge to nurse, for we will leave none to remember the insult. Now, you have your orders. See to them. The Khâls bowed, their assent absolute. The logic was cold, but it was the logic of their Votann. It was law. As they dispersed to begin the greatest and most terrible undertaking in their history, Grimdark remained. He looked back at the pulsing blue heart of the final reckoner. He felt no pride, no fear, no remorse. He felt only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a problem solved. The equation of survival was written. Now, it was time to enact its bloody and final arithmetic upon the unwary stars. The fleets of the Khâlsark Combine began to move, their great engines burning with a purpose hidden from all, a purpose that would drown a sector of the galaxy in silence and ash. The Khâlsark Combine did not move like a war fleet. It did not gather with the sharp, predatory grace of an imperial battle group or the anarchic, roaring chaos of an Orkwa. It assembled with the ponderous, inexorable gravity of a tectonic plate grinding into motion. From a dozen star systems, the assets of the Combine converged upon the designated muster point. The dead, lightless void of the Oort cloud surrounding the gas giant designated G. Kubek Parshibi. There were no grand pronouncements, no soaring martial hymns. There was only the low thrum of a million fusion drives and the cold, voiceless chatter of logistical data streams. Fastness was the fleet's defining characteristic. At its core were the Behemoth-class land fortresses, the principle of yield, the quota met, and the final calculation. These were not mere ships. They were mobile worlds, city-sized agglomerations of foundries, refineries, and habitation domes. Their surfaces bristling with cranes, launch bays, and docking arms meant for processing entire asteroid fields. Around them gathered the bolt haulers, colossal vessels whose cargo holds could swallow moons whole, their flanks scarred and pitted from millennia of abrasive mining. Orbiting these leviathans were the fleets of prospectors, the long-range exploration and resource extraction vessels. These were the ships that would serve as the Combine's public face, their hulls painted with the open-handed cog and mountain sigil of peaceful industry. To the rest of the galaxy, the mobilization was announced through carefully managed channels. Rogue trader networks received encrypted offers of unprecedented bulk trade in raw adamantium and sacred gold, available for collection at specified barter points on the edge of the Viridian Veil in 2 standard Terran years. Astropathic relays on Imperial listening posts picked up fragments of a grand declaration, carefully crafted by UR to be intercepted. It spoke of the Grand Viridian prospect, a glorious, generation-spanning endeavor to tap the untold riches of the galactic fringe, a quest for resources that would bring prosperity to all who partnered with the industrious kin. It was a masterpiece of corporate propaganda, couched in the bland, inoffensive language of commerce and progress. It was utterly, terrifyingly believable. While the galaxy saw a mining expedition, a far different truth unfolded in the shielded holds of the fleet. Brokir ironmasters, their faces illuminated by the green glow of tactical displays, oversaw the silent work of their ironkin. The colossal seismic charges, designed to crack open planetary crusts, were not being unloaded, but modified. Their seismic wave generators were recalibrated to produce resonant frequencies that could liquefy plasteel and shatter ceramite at a molecular level. The powerful laser drills, capable of boring a shaft through a continent, were fitted with new focusing arrays that could concentrate their beams to a pinpoint of star-hot energy, turning them into lances that could pierce the void shields of a capital ship. The holds of the bulk haulers were not being prepared for ore, but for biomass. Cavernous chambers were fitted with nutrient reclamation vats and protein distillers, each the size of a cathedral, ready to render down entire ecosystems into gray, nutrient-rich slurry. The diplomatic offensive began concurrently. It was a campaign waged not with shells, but with contracts and temptations. From the principle of yield, a dozen fast-moving courier vessels detached, their mission to secure passage rights through the territories that bordered the Viridian Vale. The most critical of these missions was entrusted to Brokir Techlord Valen, a kin whose age could be measured in centuries, and whose heart had long been replaced by a perfectly efficient augmetic pump. Accompanied by his Ironkin attaché, Unit Chirbex Hamshipsa, he was dispatched to the Kar-Dryad system, a small independent human empire ruled by a council of navigator houses who controlled the only stable warp route into the Vale's outer rim. Valen's ship, the Honest Ledger, was a picture of non-threatening utility. It broadcasted trade canticles and requests for parley. When he was finally granted an audience in the impossibly ornate Spire of Scryers on Caradryad Prime, he appeared as the very archetype of a Votann merchant. He was short, broad, and clad in practical, void-sealed gear, his face obscured by a thick, gray beard and a rebreather mask. Unit Chirbex Samshipsa stood silently beside him, a gleaming automaton that was both bodyguard and mobile data codex. The Navigator Primes looked down upon him from their towering thrones, their three-eyed gaze unsettling and arrogant. "You ask much, little man of stone." The eldest, Prime Zathros, spoke, his voice a reedy whisper. "Passage for a fleet of your size through our domains is no small matter. The archenemy is ever present. The currents of the Empyrean are fickle. The toll will be significant." Techlord Valen bowed his head, a gesture of carefully calculated humility. "Great Primes, the Khâlsark Combine understands the value of your service. We do not ask for charity. We offer payment." With a gesture, Unit Chilbex Humshipsa projected a holographic image between them. It was a spinning asteroid of impossible purity, a solid mass of flawless Jormungand-grade adamantium, 10 kilometers in diameter. "This is but a sample of the wealth we seek," Valen's synthesized voice rumbled. "This rock, and 10 more like it, will be delivered to your astropath's designated coordinates as a gesture of goodwill upon the signing of our passage treaty." A murmur went through the assembled navigators. Such a quantity of pure adamantium could fund their houses for 1,000 years. It could build fleets, raise armies, secure their dominance for generations. "And what is the price beyond this gesture?" Prime Zathros asked, his greed warring with his caution. "Only this," Valen replied, projecting a new chart. It showed the warp route and a single, simple addendum to their standard passage charters, a non-interference clause. "Our fleet is large and its work is complex. We must not be disturbed. For the duration of our grand prospect, no vessel of Caradryad may enter the Viridian Vale. No questions may be asked of our operations. In return for this simple privacy, we will grant you exclusive rights to 1/10 of all unliving mineral wealth we extract. Your dynasty will become legend." It was a devil's bargain, wrapped in the language of unparalleled opportunity. The navigators saw a chance to become richer and more powerful than they had ever dreamed, all for the simple price of looking the other way. They did not question what a mining fleet could possibly need such absolute privacy for. They did not wonder what unliving mineral wealth specifically excluded. They saw only the glittering promise of a mountain of adamantium, and they agreed. As the Honest Ledger departed Caradryad, its mission successful, Valen stood on his bridge, watching the planet recede. Unit Chilbex Humshipsa stood beside him. Calculation complete, the Ironkin stated in its flat, metallic monotone. Probability of Caradryad betrayal within the designated operational timeframe, Shibi Jum Chill %. Acceptable. "They are greedy," Valen said, his own voice devoid of triumph. "And the greedy are predictable. They will honor the deal as long as it benefits them. By the time they realize the true nature of our work, the Veil will be silent, and we will be gone." He looked out at the star charts, at the first designated target system, now flashing on the main display. "Inform the Cull. The way is clear. The first harvest can begin." Across the silent void, the great fleet of the Khâlsark Combine received the message. With the slow, synchronized grace of a perfectly designed machine, thousands of vessels altered their trajectories. Engines that had idled for weeks now burned with cold, blue fire. The Grand Viridian prospect was underway. Its target, the Shan hegemony, a civilization of avian Xenos whose greatest crime was to exist upon a world rich in resources, directly in the path of a people who had calculated that their survival depended on the silence of all other voices in the galaxy. The Lashan system was a jewel of tranquility, a place untouched by the galaxy's endless wars. Its star, a gentle yellow dwarf, bathed the system's single life-bearing world in benevolent light. Lashan Prime was a planet of breathtaking beauty, a tapestry of lush, jade-green continents, swirling sapphire oceans, and skies perpetually adorned with clouds of iridescent violet. Its masters, the Lashan, were an avian species of sublime grace. They were not warriors or conquerors, they were architects, poets, and dreamers. Their cities were not fortresses of stone and steel, but soaring spires of living, crystalline wood, grown and shaped over generations to harmonize with the planet's ecosystem. They communed with their world through a form of resonant song, their voices shaping the very air and encouraging the growth of the flora around them. When the Khâlsark Combine fleet translated from the warp at the system's edge, the Shan were filled with a profound sense of wonder. Their astronomers had tracked the approaching vessels for weeks, marveling at their sheer scale. The messages that preceded them spoke of trade, of shared knowledge, of a mutual desire for peaceful exchange. The Lushan hegemony, governed by a council of their most accomplished chanters, saw this as the culmination of a millennium of prophecy, the arrival of star travelers who would join them in singing the great song of the universe. The Combine fleet did nothing to dispel this illusion. It advanced slowly, cautiously, its immense ships arranged in a formation that suggested a convoy, not an armada. They broadcasted greetings in 1,000 different codecs, their machine spirits patiently cycling through languages until they found a mathematical dialect the Shan could comprehend. Grimdark's voice, filtered through layers of translation software, was a calm, reassuring baritone. He spoke of his people as humble prospectors, seekers of raw materials to build a better future, and offered gifts of rare, inert isotopes and perfectly synthesized energy crystals in exchange for permission to conduct geological surveys on their world. The Chanters Council, after a day of joyous, resonant debate, agreed. They saw no deception. The ships were ugly utilitarian things, true, but they bore no obvious weapons. The Votann themselves, seen only on grainy pict casts, seemed a sturdy, unassuming people. The Shan sent back their acceptance, a soaring chorus of welcome that echoed through the Combine's communication arrays. On the bridge of the principle of yield, the sound was registered as a meaningless burst of broadband sonic energy and was immediately filtered out as background noise. The descent began. Dozens of the Combine's largest landers detached from the fleet and began their slow, inexorable entry into Lashan Prime's violet atmosphere. To the Lushan watching from their crystalline balconies, they were mountains of metal descending from the heavens, awesome and terrible in their scale. They landed with ground-shaking force in the vast open plains between the major city spires, their landing struts crushing ancient forests into splinters. Ramps, hundreds of meters wide, lowered with hydraulic hisses that drowned out the natural sounds of the world. There was a moment of expectant silence. The Lashan gathered, their elegant feathered forms a vibrant counterpoint to the drab gray of the Votann ships. They prepared songs of greeting, ready to welcome the geologists and merchants. What emerged was not life, but its antithesis. From the cavernous holds marched the Ironkin, legions of them, their polished metal bodies gleaming in the alien sun. They moved with unnerving, synchronized precision, forming a vast, silent perimeter around the landing zones. Behind them came the true purpose of the mission. The machines, they were not drills and scanners, they were mobile factories of planetary-scale destruction. Continent-spanning behemoths on hundreds of massive tracks. They unfolded with a symphony of grinding gears and pressurizing pistons. Great maws, kilometers wide, opened at their fronts, lined with tungsten carbide teeth the size of hab blocks. Towering cranes, ending not in claws, but in crackling atomantic decomposer arrays, swiveled into position. These were the planetary processors, the ultimate expression of the Combine's horrifying new creed. The Great Culling began without a declaration of war, without a single word of anger or hate. It began with the cold, impersonal activation of a switch from orbit. A low hum filled the air, a sound that vibrated in the very bones of the planet. The sonic pulverizers on the lead machines activated. They did not fire shells or beams. They projected a wave of pure, devastating resonance, perfectly tuned to the molecular structure of the Shan's living cities. The elegant, soaring spires of crystalline wood, which had stood for 10,000 years, did not explode. They simply disintegrated, collapsing into shimmering clouds of fine, organic dust that were immediately sucked into the intake vents of the machines following behind. The Lashan's song of welcome turned into a chorus of terror. Their small defense force, a militia of skyriders on winged beasts, took to the air, their ceremonial energy lances glowing defiantly. Before they could even form up, the orbital defense grids of the Combine fleet logged on the tactical display as meteorite interception lasers fired. Pencils of invisible light stabbed down from the heavens, and the skyriders and their mounts vanished in silent, instantaneous puffs of vaporized gas. On the ground, the slaughter was not even a conflict. It was an industrial process. The Shan warriors who charged the machines were simply ignored. Some were crushed beneath the colossal tracks, their bodies barely registering as a change in traction pressure to the controlling ironkin. Most were swept up by the biomass converters. These vast engines of consumption projected a powerful gravitic field, pulling in everything before them: trees, soil, animals, and the Lashan themselves. Their terrified screams were lost in the roar of the grinders as their bodies were rendered down, their unique biology and ancient culture reduced to a flow of quantifiable organic compounds directed into massive storage tanks. From the command throne of the Principle of Yield, Grimdark watched the harvest unfold on a dozen holographic displays. He did not see a planetary genocide. He saw a supremely efficient resource acquisition. One screen showed the declining biomass signature of the planet's surface. Another displayed the rising levels of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphates in the holds of the bulk hauler. A third tracked the elemental composition of the pulverized cities, logging them as valuable silicates and complex hydrocarbons. The death of a civilization was, to him and the final reckoner, a series of cascading green lights on a progress report. The operation was proceeding ahead of schedule. Within a single solar cycle, it was over. The green continents were gone, scraped clean down to the bedrock. The sapphire oceans had been drained, pumped into orbit where colossal filtration arcs separated the water from its salt and mineral content, leaving nothing but a vast, dry basin of cracked mud. The violet atmosphere itself was being siphoned, its gases cryogenically sorted and stored. The Lashan, a species of poets and dreamers who had existed for eons, were now nothing more than several thousand metric tons of processed protein slurry, cryogenically frozen and logged in the Honest Ledger's cargo manifest. The planetary processors retracted their implements, folded back into their transport configurations, and re-embarked onto the landers. They left behind a world that was no longer a world. Lashan Prime was a perfectly smooth gray sphere of sterile rock, devoid of life, water, or air. It had been stripped, processed, and consumed. In the silent void, the Khâlsark Combine fleet reassembled. The holds of its ships were full. The first entry in the Grand Viridian Prospects ledger was closed. Quotamet. Yield maximized. The cold, logical heart of the Combine felt no remorse, only the dull satisfaction of a task efficiently completed. The fleet turned its attention toward the next target on its list, the subsector of St. Gideon's Reach and the teeming hive worlds of man. Lasthenius was a monument to the Imperium's indomitable, miserable spirit. It was a world entombed in its own industry, where the sky was a permanent shroud of chemical smog, and the rain fell as a weak, stinging acid. Its continents were paved over with ferrocrete and plasteel, dominated by the impossible verticality of its hive cities. Billions upon billions of souls teemed in its hab blocks, their lives a relentless cycle of labor, prayer, and procreation, all in service to the unblinking eye of the God Emperor. The planet was a fortress, the linchpin of the St. Gideon's Reach subsector, defended by a dozen regiments of the Astra Militarum, foremost among them the Lasthenius Palshipalth Mechanized, the famed Iron Grinders, whose serried ranks of Leman-Russ battle tanks had broken Orquas and shattered heretic uprisings for 5 centuries. Its governor, Lord General Marius Van Drock, was a man forged in the crucible of imperial command, proud, unyielding, and utterly certain of the righteousness of his cause and the strength of his walls. When the Khâlsark Combine fleet arrived, it did so without warning or preamble. One moment, the system's augurs showed empty space. The next, reality itself seemed to tear open as a fleet of such impossible scale emerged from the warp that it eclipsed the local star. The light of day on Lasthenius dimmed, plunging the already gloomy world into an unnatural twilight. Alarms shrieked across the planet. The system's defense fleet, a proud line of Imperial cruisers and frigates, moved to intercept, their commanders broadcasting challenges and threats, demanding the unidentified fleet identify itself or be destroyed. The Combine did not answer with words. The response came from the flanks of their fleet, from vessels that Imperial Navy tacticians dismissed as unarmed bulk haulers or ungainly asteroid miners. From colossal launch bays designed to fire seismic probes, the Combine unleashed a volley of planet-cracking demolition charges. These were not torpedoes that sought out targets. They were city-sized projectiles that flew on brute force, their drives spitting raw plasma. They did not detonate on impact. Instead, their warheads activated a split second before, unleashing a focused gravimetric pulse of such power that it warped space itself. The Imperial cruiser, Vengeful Saint, was the first to die. Its void shields flared and died in the same instant. The ship did not explode, it was compressed, its prow forced into its stern as if by a titan's fist, crushing its 1,000-man crew into a single, dense ingot of metal and flesh before it silently tumbled into the void. The Imperial fleet, a force that had held the sector for a millennium, was erased from existence in less than a minute. Its mighty warships turned into drifting, compacted coffins. On Lasthenius, Lord General Vandrock watched the picked feed from orbit go dead. A cold dread, an emotion he had not felt since his first battle as a cadet, settled in his gut. There was no time to process the loss. The enemy was descending. Their landers were the size of city districts, immense rust-colored blocks that cared nothing for aerodynamics, simply bludgeoning their way through the atmosphere on pillars of raw thrust. They ignored the designated spaceports and landing fields, instead crashing down with tectonic force onto the vast, ash-choked plains that separated the Hive cities. From his command bunker deep within Hive Primus, Vandrock gave the order: advance and engage. All regiments. The Iron Grinders will lead the charge. Annihilate the Xenos filth. For the Emperor. The armored columns of the Lasthenius Parshiparth rolled out from the Hive gates, a river of steel and righteous fury. 2,000 lemon rust tanks, supported by chimeras carrying legions of guardsmen, advanced across the plains of rust towards the nearest landing zone. Their tank commanders were confident no Xenos vessel, no matter how large, could stand against the concentrated firepower of a full Imperial armored regiment. What they met was not an army, it was a mobile geological survey team from hell. The Votann machines, the Strata harvesters, were deployed. They were not tanks or titans, they were walking factories, immense tripods whose central bodies were a tangle of refineries and furnaces, their legs powerful enough to crush rockcrete to dust. They moved with a slow, grinding purpose, ignoring the incoming artillery shells that exploded ineffectually against their industrial-grade hulls. They did not fire back with cannons or missiles. As the Imperial tanks came into range, the lead Strata harvester deployed its primary tool, a planetary crustbreaker. It was a colossal arm ending in a hammerhead that pulsed with unimaginable gravitic force. It swung down, not at a single tank, but at the ground itself. The impact sent a shockwave through the plains, a ripple in the very bedrock of the planet. The ground beneath the charging Leman Russ column buckled and split. Tanks were thrown into the air like toys, entire squadrons swallowed by fissures that opened in the ferrocrete. Then came the processors. Following the harvesters were swarms of smaller, faster machines. Some projected wide magnetic fields that seized the wreckage of the broken tanks, lifting them from the ground crews still screaming inside and depositing them onto conveyor belts that fed directly into the roaring smelters of the larger constructs. Others unspooled vast nets of monomolecular wire that scythed through infantry ranks, neatly dicing thousands of guardsmen before dragging the bloody remains into biomass converters. The war for Lasthenius was not a war of territory or tactics. It was a war of consumption. Where the Khâlsark Combine advanced, the world ceased to exist. They did not capture Hive Secundus, they disassembled it. Vast pulverizer arrays emitting dissonant sonic frequencies reduced Hablocks to powder, which was then sorted by elemental analyzers and vacuumed into storage silos. The billions of inhabitants were not fought, they were harvested. Neurotoxins, pumped through the ventilation systems, killed them in their homes, and their bodies were then systematically extracted by swarms of ironkin drones, their biomass logged and processed with chilling efficiency. Lord General Vandrock watched in horror as Hive Secundus, a city of 4 billion souls, vanished from the tactical map over the course of a single day, replaced by a flat, sterile plain of bedrock. His regiments were not being defeated, they were being recycled. Every shell they fired, every tank they lost, every man who died was simply more raw material for the invaders. "They are not fighting us," he whispered, his face pale in the glow of the failing displays. "They are mining us." The ground began to shake, a deep, grinding vibration that resonated through the 30 levels of adamantium and rockcrete above his command bunker. One of the strata harvesters had reached the foundations of Hive Primus. It was not laying siege, it was beginning its excavation. The Lord General drew his bolt pistol, its grip a familiar comfort in a world gone mad. He would not be processed. He would not become a statistic on a Xenos production report. As the roof of his bunker began to crack and groan, the last Lord of Lasthenius prepared to meet his end, a final, futile act of defiance against an enemy who measured victory not in glory but in yield. The crucible of Lasthenius was not forging heroes. It was rendering a world down to slag. In the cold calculus of the Great Culling, one name rose above the drone of machinery and the silent scream of dying worlds: Khâlsark Grimdark. He was not a warrior king in the mold of an orc war boss or a space marine chapter master. He did not see glory on the battlefield, nor did he revel in the visceral thrill of combat. His legend was not forged in the crucible of heroic duels, but in the sterile, data-rich environment of the principle of yield, command deck. He was a new kind of conqueror for a new kind of war, an industrial-age butcher whose genius lay not in tactics, but in logistics, efficiency, and the ruthless maximization of return. Grimdark's daily ritual was a testament to his nature. He did not review troop movements or study enemy dispositions. Instead, he spent 18 hours of every cycle standing before the primary data loom, a swirling vortex of holographic information that displayed the operational status of the entire Grand Viridian prospect. He monitored the flow rate of processed biomass from Hive Tertius, cross-referencing it with the energy expenditure of the converter engines to optimize fuel consumption. He analyzed the tensile strength of the plasteel harvested from the hab blocks of Hive Quartus, adjusting the pulverizer frequencies by a fraction of a percentage point to ensure a pure, more valuable yield of raw polymers. He was a factory foreman presiding over the disassembly line of a planet. His infamy was cemented during the final stages of the Lasthenius campaign. Hive Primus, the capital, a mountain of adamantium and humanity that scraped the toxic clouds, remained defiant. Lord General Vandrock was dead, but his subordinate, Marshal Evangeline Rostova, had rallied the surviving elements of the Iron Grinders and tens of millions of Hive militia into a formidable defense. The Hive's lower levels were a labyrinth of barricaded tunnels and fortified bulkheads. The Votann's ground-based processors, so effective on the open plains, were struggling to advance through the choked confines, their efficiency ratings dropping to unacceptable levels. The siege was costing the Combine time and energy, two resources Grimdark valued far more than the lives of his kin. His command staff, the Lords of the Hearth, gathered to propose solution. Kol'jorn the Grudge-Bound argued for a conventional assault, a glorious charge of Einhir Hearthguard to break the defenders' morale through honor and force. Rokir Techlord Valen proposed a complex plan to inject corrosive nanites into the Hive's water supply, a slower but more resource-efficient method. Grimdark listened to them all, his expressionless faceplate betraying no opinion. When they were finished, he simply raised a hand for silence. He turned to the data loom and manipulated the controls. A new projection filled the room, a structural and gravimetric analysis of Hive Primus. "The problem is not the defenders," Grimdark stated, his voice a flat, synthesized rumble. "They are an irrelevant variable. The problem is the structure. It is an inefficient container for the resources held within. We are attempting to empty a vessel through a pinhole." He pointed to a series of glowing blue nodes on the holographic schematic. They marked the primary gravitic stabilizers that held the upper one-third of the colossal Hive spire aloft. The defenders are concentrated in the lower levels, the base of the mountain. The true value, the administrative centers, the noble spires, the Schola Progenium academies, is in the upper strata. It contains the highest concentration of advanced technology, precious metals, and well-fed, high-quality biomass. Techlord Valen's optical sensors widened. "Earthane, you cannot mean to." "I do," Grimdark interrupted. "We are not besieging a fortress. We are demolishing a building. Deploy the gravitic tractors. Reroute all available power from the ground processors. We will not break down the door. We will collapse the roof." The order was as audacious as it was monstrous. It was not a military strategy. It was an act of celestial engineering. 5 of the Combine's largest bulk haulers, ships designed to move asteroids, took up position high in the atmosphere above Hive Primus. From their underbellies, they projected beams of pure, focused gravity, invisible to the naked eye, but powerful enough to bend light. They did not target the hive itself, but the empty space around its upper spire, creating a localized gravity well of immense power. On the ground, Marshal Rostova's defenders felt it first as a strange, unnerving lightness. Dust and debris began to lift from the streets. Then, the groaning began, a sound of stressed metal and tortured rockcrete on a scale that defied comprehension. The entire upper third of Hive Primus, a section of the city that housed nearly 10 billion people and weighed trillions of tons, began to tear away from its foundations. There was no battle, no heroic last stand. There was only the sound of a mountain dying. The spire, a monument of imperial pride that had stood for 6,000 years, ripped free with a cataclysmic shriek of tortured metal. For a terrifying, silent moment, it hung suspended in the sky, held by the artificial gravity of the Votann ships. Then, Grimdark gave the final command. The tractors disengaged. The spire of Hive Primus fell. It struck the base of the city with the force of a dozen asteroid impacts. The ensuing shockwave registered on seismographs across the segmentum. Marshal Rostova, the Iron Grinders, the millions of militia, and the billions of civilians they were defending were not just killed, they were obliterated, atomized in the kinetic impact, their bodies and souls becoming part of a new strata of compressed, superheated matter. Khâlsark Grimdark watched the event on his data loom, his sensors registering the seismic data, the thermal bloom, and the release of atmospheric radiation. Tomb, created, he said, his voice betraying no emotion. Resources consolidated. Begin processing operations. For the next solar month, the machines of the Khâlsark Combine descended upon the ruins of Hive Primus. They did not need to fight their way through tunnels or clear barricades. Their task was now simple excavation. They carved into the newly formed mountain of wreckage, their grinders and smelters working at peak efficiency, harvesting the compressed wealth of a civilization from its self-made grave. The siege of Hive Primus was over. It would be remembered not as a battle, but as the single most efficient resource extraction in the history of the kin. And Khâlsark Grimdark, the architect of this cold, industrial damnation, would be remembered not as a warrior, but as a legend of a far more terrible and pragmatic kind. The destruction of Lasthenius did not go unnoticed. It was too vast, too absolute to be hidden. The psychic death scream of 100 billion souls rippled through the warp, a tidal wave of agony that caused astropaths 1,000 light-years away to scream, bleed, and die at their posts. The sudden, total silence from a subsector capital, a bastion of imperial power, sent a jolt of pure, cold fear through the command structure of the Segmentum Pacificus. This was no mere raid, no localized Xenos incursion. This was an act of extermination on a scale that beggared belief, carried out with a speed and efficiency that spoke of a terrifying new power. From the fortress moon of Hydra Fur, Segmentum Command responded with the only tool it possessed for such an existential threat, the Crusade. Crusade Fleet Tertius was assembled, a vast and glorious instrument of the Emperor's wrath. It was a fleet born of righteous fury, comprised of over 300 warships drawn from a dozen different sector battle fleets. At its heart was a core of Imperial Navy Majesty, the Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra, a vessel whose forward lance batteries could crack a continent. 3 Retribution-class battleships, their flanks bristling with macro-cannon batteries that fired shells the size of cathedrals, and a swarm of cruisers, escorts, and support craft, each a testament to the Imperium's martial might. Leading this magnificent armada was a man who was himself a living legend, Lord Admiral Christian Var. Var was the epitome of the imperial nobility, tall, hawk-faced, with a gaze as cold and unforgiving as the void itself. He had commanded fleets for 2 centuries, his name a litany of victories against Chaos Reavers, Orc Freebooters, and Eldar Corsairs. He was a master of the classic naval doctrines, of the glorious broadside, the decisive torpedo spread, the heroic boarding action. He looked upon the reports from St. Gideon's Reach, saw the picked captures of the squat, ugly Votann ships, and felt a surge of contemptuous anger. These were miners, scrappers, filthy abhumans who had grown too bold. He would not just defeat them, he would humiliate them, break their fleet, and grind their pathetic civilization back into the dust from which it crawled. Crusade fleet Tertius entered the Viridian Vale like a thunderbolt. Var, eschewing caution for righteous speed, ordered a direct course for the now dark Listhenius system. His astropaths screamed of the lingering psychic stain, of a silence in the Empyrean that was somehow louder and more terrifying than any cacophony. Var ignored them. Fear was a tool of the enemy, and he would not wield it. They found the Khâlsark Combine fleet waiting for them in the cold darkness where Listhenius once orbited its star. The Votann had made no effort to hide. They hung in the void in a loose, almost careless formation, their great, blocky ships showing no obvious signs of aggression. Grimdark's fleet was outnumbered 3-1 in dedicated warships, a fact that filled Lord Admiral Var with a grim satisfaction. This would be a slaughter. All vessels, Var's voice boomed across the fleet-wide Vox. Assume battle line formation. Teach these vermin the price of defiance. Open fire at will. For the throne! The Imperial fleet obeyed with practiced perfection. A wave of steel and fire, miles wide, surged forward. The prow of the Dominus Astra glowed with incandescent energy as its primary lances charged, a promise of swift, planetary-scale destruction. On the bridge of the Principle of Yield, Grimdark watched the Imperial advance on his data loom. The display was not a tactical map, but a resource analysis. It identified the class of each Imperial ship, calculated its approximate metallic mass, its potential energy output if its plasma drives were breached, and the estimated biomass of its crew. To Grimdark, the approaching crusade was not an enemy fleet, it was a mobile asteroid field of exceptionally high-quality, pre-refined materials. The adversary is employing a standard broadside Victorium formation, Tech Lord Valen reported, his voice calm, predictable. Their fire control solutions are focused on our behemoth-class vessels. As the calculation predicted, Grimdark replied, they see our largest ships as the greatest threat. They fail to understand their function. They are factories, not battleships. The true threat is the tool, not the hand that wields it. He issued a single simple command: execute asset acquisition pattern, Crescent. The Votann fleet responded. The huge, slow behemoths and bulk haulers did not retreat. They simply held their position, their void shields flaring to life, absorbing the first devastating volleys from the Imperial fleet. Lance beams of pure energy, powerful enough to pierce a small moon, splashed harmlessly against shields designed to withstand the gravitational shear of a black hole. Macro cannon shells detonated in silent, blossoming flowers of fire, their shrapnel doing little more than scouring the paint from the kilometers of armored hull. While the Imperial fleet was focused on this unbreakable core, the smaller, faster ships on the Combine's flanks moved. These were the vessels the Imperium had dismissed as minors and prospects. They were not fast or agile, but they accelerated with a relentless, unstoppable momentum. They did not maneuver into firing positions. They simply flew straight towards the Imperial battle line. Lord Admiral Var watched their approach with a frown. What is this foolishness? Are they attempting a ramming action? Target their engines! It was too late. As they closed the distance, the mining ships revealed their true purpose. From their prows, where seismic drills and ore extractors should have been, massive pylons extended. Between these pylons, a shimmering field of energy coalesced. The Imperial ships fired, their point defense batteries spitting a storm of shells. But the Votann vessels were built to withstand asteroid impacts and radiation storms. They were impossibly durable. Then, they fired. It was not a weapon Var had ever seen. There was no beam, no projectile. There was only a silent, instantaneous distortion in the space between the Votann ships and their targets. The Imperial light cruiser Fist of Dorn was the first to feel its effect. A planet-cracking demolition charge, repurposed as a short-range void weapon, created a gravitic pulse that did not seek to pierce its hull, but to unmake it. The Fist of Dorn was not torn apart. It was violently and completely disassembled. Its armor plates buckled and flew off. Its decks pancaked. Its spine snapped in a dozen places at once. In a split second, a proud warship was reduced to a cloud of component parts, drifting alongside the flash-frozen corpses of its crew. Panic rippled through the Imperial fleet. This was not battle. It was deconstruction. The Votann miners plowed into the Imperial formation, their gravitic weapons firing at point-blank range. Warships that had survived centuries of conflict were unmade in moments. Their hulls peeled open, Their reactors breached, their crews vented into the void. The glorious Imperial battle line dissolved into chaos and terror. Var, his face a mask of horrified disbelief, watched his fleet being systematically dismantled. His tactical genius, his centuries of experience, were useless against an enemy who refused to fight a battle, an enemy who was simply harvesting his ships like they had harvested the world below. "All ships, full retreat! Reform at the Mandeville Point!" he roared, his pride shattered. But there was no retreat. As the Imperial ships turned to flee, the true trap was sprung. The massive behemoths and bulk haulers, which had been passive observers until now, activated their own gravitic systems. But they were not weapons, they were tractor beams, immensely powerful, designed to capture and hold rogue planetoids. Now they locked onto the fleeing Imperial ships, halting them in their tracks, dragging them back towards the center of the Votann formation like a fisherman hauling in a net. Lord Admiral Var felt his magnificent flagship, the Dominus Astra, shudder and groan as it was caught in multiple tractor fields. On the main view screen, he saw the ultimate horror. One of the Votann's colossal factory arcs, the Quota Met, was approaching. Its immense forward maw, a circular opening kilometers in diameter, designed to swallow asteroids, was opening wide. Inside, he could see the roaring, white-hot glare of its primary smelting furnaces. His crusade had not come to avenge Lasthenius. It had merely come to be rendered down, to be processed, to become the next entry in the cold, endless ledger of the Great Culling. The last thing Lord Admiral Var saw was the approaching, all-consuming mouth of the factory. While Crusade Fleet Tertius was being systematically disassembled in the cold void, Khâlsark Grimdark was engaged in a different kind of battle. One fought not with demolition charges and laser drills, but with manipulated data and calculated omissions. His target was not the Imperium, but his own kind. The sheer scale of the Great Culling required resources beyond even the vast capacity of the Khâlsark Combine. To accelerate the harvest and ensure its security, Grimdark needed allies. He needed the fleets of another league. His choice fell upon the Trans-Hyperion Alliance, a league whose reputation was built on speed, exploration, and long-range intelligence gathering. Their ships were faster, their auger arrays more sensitive than any other league. They were pioneers and scouts, driven by a relentless curiosity and a pragmatic desire to be the first to claim any new discovery. Crucially, their home systems bordered the Viridian Veil, making them the most logical and most threatened potential partner. Grimdark knew he could not reveal the horrifying truth of the final Reckoner's calculation. The core tenet of the Great Culling was so antithetical to the ingrained ancestral pragmatism of the kin that most leagues would recoil in horror, viewing it as a dangerous, unpredictable madness. Honor might be a luxury variable, but the stability of interleague relations was a cornerstone of their entire civilization. To declare a war of total genocide was to invite excommunication and potentially civil war. So Grimdark crafted a lie, a fabrication of such masterful logic and verisimilitude that it would appeal directly to the Trans-Hyperion Alliance's own nature. From the data looms of the Principle of Yield, he transmitted a single, heavily encrypted data packet to the Oath Council of the Trans-Hyperion Alliance. It was addressed personally to High Call Helga Valdoder, a shrewd and cautious leader known for her reliance on hard data over sentiment. The packet contained no philosophical justifications, no calls to shared kinship. It was a cold, hard threat assessment. The data was a masterpiece of deception. Grimdark presented carefully edited pic captures from the Lasthenius campaign, stripping them of context. He showed swarms of Imperial Guard, but digitally altered their banners to crude green scrawls. He showcased the wreckage of Imperial tanks, but used fragmentation analysis to suggest their metallurgical composition was crude and scrap-built. He included recordings of Imperial Vox chatter, but ran them through filters that distorted the low Gothic into guttural, barking sounds. He augmented this with genuine long-range scans of orc activity from a neighboring sector, seamlessly splicing the energy signatures of a burgeoning wall into the sensor logs of the Viridian Veil. The picture he painted was terrifyingly plausible. He claimed his Grand Viridian prospect had stumbled upon the vanguard of unprecedented scale, one that was using human populations as a slave caste and was rapidly building a fleet from scavenged materials. He presented the destruction of Lasthenius not as a harvest, but as a desperate, preemptive strike against a major orc staging ground. The destruction of Crusade Fleet Tertius was presented as a battle against the primary fleet, a force that used captured Imperial vessels. The lie was audacious, but it was supported by gigabytes of what appeared to be irrefutable sensor data. High Cal Votann and her council spent 3 cycles analyzing the data. They were pragmatic. They knew the threat of a major WAG was one of the few existential dangers to the kin. The data, vetted by their most senior Brochure analysts, seemed genuine. The energy signatures matched known orc tech, the fleet compositions were consistent with a scavenger empire, and the sheer numbers were alarming. Grimdark's claims that this new war was operating with unusual cunning, using human thralls and captured ships, explained the atypical sensor readings. Then came Grimdark's offer, the final, perfect piece of the trap. He did not ask for help out of kinship. He proposed a joint venture. He offered the Trans-Hyperion Alliance a full 50% share of all salvage materials and territorial salvage rights from the preemptive campaign. He included manifests of the salvage already secured from Lasthenius, trillions of tons of processed plasteel, adamantium, and refined chemical compounds, to a league like the Trans-Hyperion Alliance, whose rapid expansion often outstripped their resource base. It was an offer of unimaginable wealth. They would be paid, handsomely, to help defend their own borders from a greenskin invasion. It was the ultimate pragmatic solution. His data is solid, commented Cole Yoron, Voldotter's chief of security, gesturing to the holographic display showing the projected trajectory of the WA fleet. If the Khâlsark Combine fails to contain this, we will be the next to face them. We would have to fight them eventually anyway. This way, we fight them on our terms, and our coffers will be full for the next 5 centuries. High Cole Valdatir, her face a mask of stern concentration, made her decision. The logic was inescapable. The data was verified. The threat was real, and the profit was undeniable. To refuse would be illogical, an act of sentiment over survival. Send the signal, she commanded. The Trans-Hyperion Alliance accepts the joint venture. Our fleets will mobilize at once. Inform Khal Grimdark, his flank is secure. The betrayal was sealed not with a dagger in the dark, but with a digitally signed contract. Across the sector, the sleek, fast warships of the Trans-Hyperion Alliance began to burn their engines. Their kindreds mustered, believing they were about to embark on a glorious and profitable war against the Greenskin menace. They were being sent to assist in a genocide, their role to form the second jaw of a trap that would snap shut on the broken remnants of Crusade Fleet Tertius. Aboard the Will of Iron, Lord Admiral Var was desperately trying to rally his shattered fleet. He had lost nearly half his ships, but he was a Var, and a Var did not retreat. He was consolidating his remaining forces, preparing for a last desperate counterattack against the main Khâlsark command vessels. Then his augurs screamed. A new fleet, massive and fast, was translating from the warp directly on his flank. For a moment, a flicker of desperate hope ignited in his heart. Reinforcements. Segmentum Command must have sent a second fleet. That hope turned to ash. As the identification runes resolved on his view screen, they were more of the squat, powerful Xenos ships. But these were different, sleeker, faster, marked with the sigil of a 3-pointed star. They did not move to engage the Khâlsark fleet. They moved to form a pincer. The Vox crackled with a single clear omnidirectional broadcast from the new arrivals, a message spoken in cold, precise Low Gothic. By the authority of the Trans-Hyperion Khâlsark Salvage Accord, this sector is now a restricted resource extraction zone. All non-kin vessels are designated as salvageable assets. Surrender your vessels for processing or be dismantled by force. Lord Admiral Var stared, his mind unable to comprehend the totality of the betrayal. It was not just one fleet of these monstrous miners. It was 2. His crusade was not just a failure. It was a doomed footnote in the ledger of a Xenos resource grab. He looked at the closing jaws of the Votann fleets, at the cold, uncaring stars of the Viridian Veil, and for the first time in his life, he knew the true meaning of despair. His last order was not one of defiance, but of simple, bitter finality. Commend your souls to the Emperor. We die here. The Great Culling was a war of numbers, a campaign waged on data slates and logistical projections, but its true cost was not measured in tons of processed biomass or ingots of recycled adamantium. The true attrition was metaphysical, an erosion of the kin's very soul. The Khâlsark Combine and their new unwitting allies in the Trans-Hyperion Alliance were becoming something other than what they had been. They were being hollowed out from the inside, their ancient traditions and deep-seated kinship replaced by the cold, unfeeling logic of the final Reckoner's equation. On the processing worlds, the work ground on with relentless round-the-clock efficiency. The Hearthkin warriors, who stood guard over the colossal biomass converters, no longer sang the sagas of their ancestors to pass the long hours. The roar of the machinery was too loud, and besides, the old songs of grudges and honor felt strangely irrelevant here. They spoke instead of cycle times, of the viscosity of the nutrient slurry, of the minor fluctuations in the atmospheric processors. Their conversations were the conversations of factory workers, their concerns those of technicians. The thrill of battle, the righteous satisfaction of avenging a wrong, were gone. There was no enemy to hate, only a resource to be gathered. They were no longer warriors, they were foremen on a planetary abattoir. The change was most profound among the Einhire Hearthguard, the elite protectors of the Khâls. Clad in their hulking exo-armor, they had once been the living embodiments of the Votann's strength and endurance, their oaths of loyalty sworn in fire and iron. Now, their primary role was extermination control. They were deployed to clear out the last pockets of resistance in the underhives of dead worlds, not to fight a glorious battle, but to ensure the biomass extraction drones could proceed without interruption. An Einhard champion, a veteran of 100 battles, would spend his day incinerating nests of terrified civilians with his plasma pistol, not because they were a threat, but because they were a contaminant in the resource stream. The glory was gone, replaced by the grim, monotonous work of a pest exterminator. They recorded their kills not in a saga of deeds, but as a line item in a daily sanitation report. Even the rituals that bound the kin together began to decay. The great feasting halls aboard the land fortresses, where kindreds would gather to share meals, drink ale, and reaffirm their bonds, fell silent. Communal eating was deemed inefficient. Nutrient paste, calibrated for optimal energy delivery, was now dispensed at the kin's workstations. The ancient practice of the grudge swearing, where a slight against a kindred was formally declared and recorded, became obsolete. How could one swear a grudge against a foe who was not even aware of your existence before being rendered into component molecules? The very concept of a worthy enemy, so central to the kin's warrior culture, had vanished. This spiritual decay manifested in 1,000 subtle ways. The Brokier Ironmasters, once proud artisans who took immense pride in their craft, began to favor function over form in all things. The elegant runic carvings that once adorned their weapons and armor were omitted. They served no practical purpose and wasted valuable production time. The Grimnir, the shamanistic seers who communed with the Votann, found their powers waning. The psychic resonance of the Ancestor Cores, once a source of cryptic but profound wisdom, was now a flat, monotonous hum of pure data. UR-Ir, the final reckoner, did not speak in riddles or visions. It spoke in production quotas and probability matrices. The esoteric arts of the Grimnir had no place in its calculations, and so they began to atrophy, their practitioners becoming little more than confused, obsolete relics. Aboard the Trans-Hyperion Alliance flagship, the Swift Prospect, High Call Helga Valdatir began to see the first cracks in Grimdark's story. Her long-range augers, more sensitive than any in the Khâlsark fleet, were picking up strange anomalies. The orc wreckage they were salvaging contained metallurgical signatures and design philosophies inconsistent with greenskin technology. The fragmented data ghosts from the destroyed Imperial ships spoke not of a wag, but of miners and constructs. She sent a query to Grimdark, her message couched in the polite but firm language of a business partner, requesting clarification on a discrepancy in the inventory. Grimdark's reply was swift, logical, and chilling. He did not deny the deception, he simply recontextualized it. He sent her a heavily redacted summary of the final Reckoner's core calculation, framing it not as a mandate for Xenocide, but as a long-term risk assessment protocol. He presented the Great Culling as the Viridian Sector Pacification and Resource Reclamation Initiative, a necessary, if regrettable, act of preventative sector-wide sanitation to neutralize a potential future threat and secure vital resources for both their leagues. He argued that deceiving her had been a necessary step to ensure her swift cooperation against a time-sensitive threat, an act of brutal pragmatism for the greater good of all kin. Valdatir read the message in the cold silence of her command deck. She was not a monster, she was a pragmatist, and the logic, stripped of all morality, was sound. The Imperium was a demonstrable threat. The Orcs were a demonstrable threat. The Tyranids were a demonstrable threat. To systematically remove all potential threats before they could manifest was, from a certain horrifying perspective, the most pragmatic solution of all. To pull her fleets out now would be to break a contract, to abandon a profitable venture, and to make a powerful enemy of the Khâlsark Combine. It was illogical. With a heavy heart and a soul that felt suddenly cold and empty, she gave the order for her fleets to continue the operation. But the lie had taken its toll. The spirited pride of her kindreds was replaced by a sullen, silent obedience. They were no longer crusaders fighting a great greenskin menace. They were accomplices. The riches flowing into their holds felt less like the spoils of war and more like blood money. The Trans-Hyperion Alliance, the great explorers and pioneers, had lost their way. They had traded their soul for a guaranteed profit margin, and the attrition of that terrible bargain would haunt them for generations to come. The Great Culling ground on, fueled not only by the bodies of its victims, but by the slow, inexorable death of the Votann spirit. The Great Culling had achieved a momentum of its own, a terrible inertia that seemed unstoppable. World after world in the Viridian Vale was stripped bare, its history erased, its life rendered into data points on a ledger. But as the Combine's fleets pushed deeper into the sector, they approached a prize that was also their greatest obstacle: the Forge world of Xenos. This was no hive world teeming with soft biomass, nor a fledgling Xenos empire. Xenos was a bastion of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a planet-sized factory fortress ringed by orbital weapon platforms, defended by legions of Skitarii, and home to the colossal god machines of the Legio Ferrae. It was a world of steel and fire, a place where the logic of the machine reigned supreme, and it would not be harvested easily. Grimdark knew a conventional assault would be disastrously inefficient. The defenses of Xenos were formidable, designed to repel Chaos fleets and Orc armadas. A direct attack would cost the Combine dearly in ships and resources, violating the core tenet of the Great Culling: profit over all. The final reckoner, Urid, calculated that a standard siege would result in a % net resource loss. Unacceptable. A new approach was needed, a plan that bypassed the planet's strengths and struck at its very heart. A desperate gambit on a colossal scale. The plan was born from the cold, inhuman mind of the final reckoner itself. Xenos, like all Forge worlds, was powered by a vast subterranean geothermal core tap. This network of plasma conduits, drawing power from the planet's molten heart, was the single point of failure for the entire world's infrastructure. If the core could be destabilized, Xenos would not just be defeated, it would be broken apart from within, its own power turning against it in a cataclysm of unimaginable proportions. The planet would, in effect, process itself. The problem was reaching it. The core tap controls were located in the Basilica Mechanicus, the most heavily fortified structure on the planet, situated 30 kilometers beneath the surface and protected by layers of void shielding and legions of the Cult Mechanicus's finest warriors. A surface assault was impossible. The only way in was through the planet itself. Grimdark's plan was elegant in its brutal simplicity. He would use the Combine's most powerful industrial tool, not as a weapon, but as a delivery system. He selected one of his largest behemoth-class land fortresses, the Unsparing Audit, a vessel whose primary function was deep-core planetary mining. Its bow was dominated by a colossal May-Olner-class seismic drill, a weaponized boring machine capable of punching through a planet's crust to its mantle. Grimdark's gambit was to sacrifice the Unsparing Audit and its crew. He would overload its engines and drive it on a direct, suicidal collision course with Xenos. It would not strike the surface, it would drill. The ship itself would become the shaft, its drilling head carving a path straight through the planet's crust, aiming for the very heart of the Basilica Mechanicus. Riding within the drill's shock-absorbing core would be the tip of the spear, a hand-picked force of 500 Einhire Hearthguard, the elite of the Khâlsark Combine, led by the stoic and unflinching Hearthlord Vorlag. Their mission: to deploy from the wreckage of the drill, seize the core tap controls, and initiate the overload sequence. It was a suicide mission on a scale few could conceive. Hearthlord Vorlag accepted the mission without question. He and his warriors were the old guard of the Combine, kin who still remembered the sagas and the oaths, though they spoke of them less and less. This mission, this final, glorious charge into the heart of an impossible fortress, felt like a return to the old ways. It was a chance to die a warrior's death, not a foreman's. As his Hearthguard boarded the drill's transport chamber, they did so in grim silence, each warrior checking the seals on his exo-armor, the power cells of his plasma axe, the charge on his vulcanite disintegrator. They were tools of the Combine, sharpened for one final, perfect task. From the command deck of the Principle of Yield, Grimdark gave the order, the unsparing audit. Its crew, having evacuated to escort vessels, powered its engines to a level that made its hull groan in protest. It became a streak of white-hot fire against the blackness of space, a 10-kilometer-long bullet aimed at the heart of a world. The orbital defenses of Xenos erupted in a storm of fire. Laser batteries, missile silos, and macro cannon shells threw up a wall of impenetrable energy and flak. But the unsparing audit was not trying to evade. It simply absorbed the punishment, its heavily reinforced prow glowing cherry red as it plowed through the defensive screen. Layer after layer of its ablative armor was stripped away. Entire sections of the ship vaporized, but its momentum was too great. It struck the surface of Xenos not with an explosion, but with a sound that was heard in orbit, a colossal grinding shriek of tortured metal and shattered rock. The Mjolnir drill, powered by the ship's detonating reactor, bit into the adamantium-laced crust of the Forge world. The ship itself became the casing for a shaft of incandescent fury, driving deeper and deeper into the planet, its journey tracked by the titanic seismic waves it generated. Inside the drill's core, Hearthlord Vorlag and his Einhire felt the universe turn into a maelstrom of vibration and noise. Their grab plates strained to keep them upright as they descended through 30 kilometers of solid rock in less than a minute. Then, with a final, catastrophic jolt, they stopped. The drill had breached the roof of the Basilica Mechanicus. The forward hatch blew open, and the Hearthguard charged into hell. They were in a cavern of impossible size, a place of whirring machinery, chanting servitors, and the burning incense of the machine god. Before them, legions of Skitarii Rangers and Sicarian infiltrators opened fire, their radium carbines and flechette blasters filling the air with a storm of lethal energy. But the Hearthguard were clad in exo-armor forged from the hearts of stars. The small arms' fire sparked and ricocheted from their thick plates. They advanced, a slow, unstoppable wall of iron and vengeance. It was a battle of two opposing logics, the swift, surgically precise attacks of the Skitarii against the implacable, overwhelming force of the Hearthguard. Plasma axes cleaved through cybernetic bodies, their superheated blades cauterizing wounds in bursts of steam and ozone. Vulcanite disintegrators turned entire squads of tech priests into clouds of glowing ash. Vorlag himself, wielding a great, two-handed Darkstar axe, carved a path directly towards the central control altar, his every swing felling a Sicarian, Ruststalker, or a Cataphoron breacher. The cost was grievous. The Hearthguard were falling, their formidable armor breached by the focused fire of transonic blades and arc rifles. But for every one that fell, 3 more pushed forward, their advance relentless. They were dying, but they were dying for a purpose, a final calculation. Finally, Vorlag and the last 50 of his Hearthguard reached the altar. He kicked aside the mangled form of the Archmagos Dominus and slammed his fist onto the Master Control Rune. With his other hand, he keyed in the overload sequence given to him by the Final Reckoner. The great plasma conduits that fed the Basilica began to glow, the deep thrum of the planet's core rising to a terrifying, unbearable shriek. For the kin, Vorlag bellowed into his Vox, his last transmission to the fleet in orbit. The debt is paid. He raised his Darkstar axe one last time, as the first wave of pure white plasma erupted from the control altar, consuming him and his surviving warriors in its divine, terrible fire. The gambit had succeeded. The heart of Xenos had been broken. The overload of the Xylosian core was not merely an explosion. It was a planetary autopsy. The superheated plasma, denied its controlled channels, burst upwards through the planet's crust with the fury of a newborn star. The 30-kilometer shaft bored by the unsparing audit became a cannon barrel, vomiting the molten heart of the Forge world into space. From orbit, the Khâlsark Combine fleet watched as Xenos tore itself apart. Vast continents of industrial machinery were hurled into the void. The Legio Pharax's mighty titans torn from their hangars and sent tumbling end over end, their reactors failing in silent, brilliant flashes. The Forge world died, not in the clamor of battle, but in the throes of a violent, self-inflicted geological seizure. With the linchpin of the Imperial defense shattered, the Great Culling entered its final, most brutal phase. The remaining Imperial forces in the Viridian Vale, a fractured collection of demoralized guard regiments and the battered remnants of Astartes strike forces, were scattered and leaderless. Yet, they would not break. In the face of annihilation, the stubborn, bloody-minded faith of humanity burned its brightest. They coalesced around the last defensible position in the sector, the cardinal world of St. Alina's Hope, a planet of soaring cathedrals and continent-spanning shrine cities. Here, they would make their last stand. Leading this final desperate defiance was a warrior who had become a legend in his own right through the brutal campaign of retreat and resistance. Borgos, Iron Captain of the Iron Hands, 3rd Clan Company. He was a being more machine than man, his flesh long since replaced by gleaming augmetics, his heart a cold, efficient pump, his mind a repository of tactical scripture. He had witnessed the industrial horror of the Votann firsthand, and in their cold logic, he saw a grotesque parody of his own chapter's creed. The flesh was weak, but this enemy had purged not just flesh, but soul itself. Borgos came to understand that this was not a war for territory, but a war for the definition of existence. He would not allow the cold, unfeeling calculus of the machine to triumph. His command center was the blood-soaked plaza before the Grand Basilica of the Martyred Saint on St. Elena's Hope. Around him stood the last 100 Terminators of his company, the mournful gray of their ceramite, stained with the grime of a dozen lost worlds. At their side stood the fanatical warrior sisters of the Order of the Valorous Heart, their bolters raised in grim salute, and the last surviving companies of the Lesthenius Parshipparth, their faces etched with the grim memory of their recycled homeworld. Above them, the sky turned dark as the combined fleets of the Khâlsark Combine and the Trans-Hyperion Alliance established their blockade. But this time, the Votann did not begin their methodical processing from orbit. The final reckoner had calculated that the psychic faith of the defenders on this cardinal world was creating a minor but unpredictable warp fluctuation. It was an anomaly, an inefficiency that needed to be purged directly. Furthermore, the concentration of Astartes Terminator armor and Sororitas power armor represented a high-value resource node of rare materials that orbital processing might damage. A ground assault was deemed the most efficient method of acquisition. Khâl Urthane Grendock himself would lead it. It was a rare, almost unprecedented move. The Khâl was a commander, not a warrior, but URE's calculations had determined that the linchpin of the human resistance was the Astartes commander. The most direct path to victory was to eliminate this variable personally. For Grendock, it was not a matter of honor or glory. It was a surgical strike, a problem to be solved with the precise application of overwhelming force. The Votann landers descended upon the plains before the main shrine city. Their ramps lowered, and the armies of the kin disembarked. It was a sight of terrible, implacable power. Thousands of Hearthkind warriors marched in perfect, silent ranks, their ion blasters held at the ready. Chthonian berserks on their rumbling bikes formed the vanguard, their mining lasers humming with lethal energy. And at the center, marching with a weight that seemed to crack the very flagstones, came the Einhire Hearthguard, a solid wall of grim, rune-etched exo-armor. At their head was Khâl Grendock, his own suit of custom-forged warplate, making him a giant among his already formidable kin. A great, two-handed plasma axe held loosely in his gauntlet. The final battle began. It was a maelstrom of apocalyptic chaos. The massed lasguns of the Imperial Guard threw up a curtain of fire that splashed harmlessly against the Votann shields. The Sisters of Battle charged, their chainswords screaming, only to be met by the disciplined, overwhelming firepower of the Hearthkind. The battle was a clash of two diametrically opposed philosophies. The Imperium fought with faith and fury, their battle cries echoing to the heavens. The kin fought with silent, disciplined efficiency, their every shot placed for maximum effect, their every movement calculated to conserve energy and minimize risk. At the heart of the Inferno, the two titans met. Iron Captain Borgos, his Terminator armor a walking fortress, activated the teleport homer on his wrist. In a flash of blue energy, he and his entire command squad of 10 Terminators materialized directly in front of Grendock's phalanx. Power fists crackled, storm bolters roared, and the clash of ceramite on iron rang out like the doom of an age. Borgos ignored the Hearthguard around him, his every sense, organic and augmetic, focused on the Votann commander. He charged, a 2.5-ton engine of cold fury, his relic power fist, the Hand of Medusa, crackling with disruptive energy. Grendock met the charge with unnatural calm. He did not try to match the Astartes' fury. He simply sidestepped, his movements economical and precise, and brought his plasma axe around in a scything arc. The axe head, wreathed in star-hot energy, struck Borgos' shoulder. Even Terminator plate could not withstand such a blow. The ceramite and adamantium slagged, melted, and vaporized. Borgos's arm was shorn clean from his body in a spray of molten metal and cauterized flesh. The Iron Captain roared, not in pain, but in sheer, unadulterated rage. He brought his remaining power fist around in a backhand blow that would have leveled a bunker. Grimdark raised his own gauntlet, a heavy, industrial piece of equipment. A personal void shield shimmered into existence, absorbing the titanic impact with a deafening crackle of displaced energy. The feedback sent Borgos stumbling back, his augmetic eyes trying to process the impossible defense. Your anger is inefficient. Grimdark's synthesized voice boomed from his helm, the words devoid of triumph or mockery. They were a simple statement of fact. It consumes energy for a minimal return. You are a flawed design. Surrounded by the apocalyptic ruin of the last human city in the sector, the embodiment of humanity's soul fire faced the avatar of the soulless machine. The battle for the Viridian Veil would be decided here, in this final, desperate clash of titans. One fighting for a future, the other to efficiently foreclose upon it. The duel between Iron Captain Borgos and Khâlsark Grimdark was a microcosm of the entire war, a brutal ballet of diametrically opposed philosophies. Borgos fought with the accumulated fury of a fallen sector, each blow of his remaining power fist a testament to the billions of souls lost. He was a storm of righteous hatred, a being of pure, focused aggression. Grimdark, in contrast, was a picture of chilling economy. He did not meet force with force. He deflected, parried, and repositioned, his movements guided by the constant stream of predictive combat data fed to him by his armor's link to URE. He expended the minimum possible energy, waiting for the statistical certainty of his opponent's error. Around them, their honor guards were locked in a battle of attrition. The Iron Hands Terminators were monoliths of defiance, their Stormbolters chattering, their power fists crushing the skulls of Hearthguard. But the Einhire were implacable. They did not break or rout. When one fell, another stepped into the line, its plasma axe held ready. It was not courage, it was programming. They absorbed the Astartes' fury like a breakwater absorbing a storm, their numbers and discipline slowly, inevitably grinding the Terminators down. Borgos, his body screaming with 100 alarms, knew he could not win. His arm was gone, his armor breached, his movements becoming slower, more predictable. Grimdark was simply waiting for him to exhaust himself, waiting for the perfect moment for a final, efficient killstroke. The Iron Hands were not meant to be martyrs. They were meant to be engines of victory. But here, facing an enemy that was the ultimate expression of the machine, victory was a variable that had been calculated out of the equation. A new calculation was needed. With a final, desperate roar, Borgos disengaged from Grimdark and lunged toward his last surviving Terminator sergeant, a veteran named Khâlsark. Brother Sergeant, the device. He bellowed over the Vox, his voice a distorted rasp of blood and electronic static. Sergeant Khâlsark, his own armor rent and smoking, understood immediately. He ripped a bulky arcane device from the magnetic clamps on his back, a vortex grenade. It was a weapon of last resort, a relic of the dark age of technology, so dangerous and unstable that its use was forbidden except under the most dire of circumstances. Grimdark's augurs immediately identified the energy signature. His combat prognosticators screamed a single, absolute conclusion, % probability of total spatial and material annihilation within the blast radius. His programming dictated the only logical course of action, immediate withdrawal. But as he turned to move, Borgos, with the last of his strength, charged again. He did not try to strike the call. He simply wrapped his remaining arm and mangled torso around Grimdark's leg, his immense weight and the powerful servos in his armor locking him in place. He had become a living anchor. The flesh is weak, Borgos growled, his faceplate inches from Grimdark's leg armor, but it knows how to die. Sergeant Khâlsark armed the vortex grenade. The small sphere in his gauntlet began to pulse, emitting a sickening, non-Euclidean light. He looked at his captain, a final unspoken salute passing between the two old warriors. Then he began to run, not away, but towards them, a living bomb intent on taking the architect of this horror with him into oblivion. The Hearthguard, seeing the threat, opened fire. A storm of plasma and vulcanite fire converged on Khâlsark. His Terminator armor, already weakened, was annihilated. He dissolved in a flash of incandescent energy 20 meters from his target. But in the final microsecond before his death, his gauntlet opened. The armed vortex grenade tumbled through the air, its momentum carrying it forward. It landed on the blood-soaked flagstones, right between the trapped Khâl and the dying Iron Captain. There was no sound. There was no explosion. Reality simply broke. A sphere of absolute nothingness, a hole in the fabric of space-time, bloomed into existence. It consumed everything: the last of the Terminators, the first rank of the Einhire Hearthguard, the ornate stonework of the Basilica. All of it was dragged into the silent, shimmering warp breach and unmade. Borgos's defiance and Grimdark's logic were rendered equally meaningless as they were pulled apart atom by atom and erased from existence. The vortex imploded a second later, the universe rushing to heal the wound in its skin. The resulting backlash was catastrophic. A wave of raw, untamed warp energy erupted from the point of detonation, washing over the battlefield. On the Imperial side, it was a final, merciful release. The guardsmen and sisters of battle caught in the blast were simply extinguished, their souls scoured from their bodies. For the kin, the effect was far worse. The psychic neutral nature of their minds offered no protection. The raw chaos of the warp, something their ancestor cores had always shielded them from, flooded their consciousnesses. The Iron Kin on the battlefield seized up and fell silent, their positronic brains fried by the illogical energies. The living kin screamed, clutching their heads as their minds were filled with impossible colors and shrieking, carnivorous thoughts. Their disciplined battle lines dissolved into a mad, panicked rout. High above, on the bridge of the Principle of Yield, the consequences were even more severe. The vortex detonation had occurred in close proximity to the Khâlsark flagship, and the warp backlash slammed into its superstructure. Containment fields flickered, power conduits overloaded, and deep within the vessel's heart, the delicate, crystalline matrix of the final Reckoner's primary data nexus fractured. Alarms blared across the bridge, but there was no one to hear them. The entire command staff had been on the surface with Grimdark. The Votann's own cold logic became its undoing. With its command structure erased and its core consciousness critically damaged, the Principle of Yield's automated protocols took over. Its prime directive in the event of catastrophic system failure and command decapitation was simple: deny its technology to any potential enemy. Protocol Omega, Scuttle, the Ark's primary power core, a contained singularity, went critical. The Principle of Yield, a vessel the size of a small moon, detonated. The explosion was not a flash of fire, but a silent, expanding wave of pure annihilation that outshone the system's star. It vaporized the entire Votann ground army, Imperial and kin alike. It scoured the surface of St. Alina's Hope, boiling away its oceans and burning its atmosphere, turning the cardinal world into a sphere of black, glassy rock. The blast wave expanded outwards, engulfing the nearest ships of the Khâlsark and Trans-Hyperion fleets, turning them into expanding clouds of incandescent plasma. The war for the Viridian Veil was over. The Imperium had won, but there was no one left to celebrate. The sector had been saved, but the sector no longer truly existed. It was a graveyard of silent, stripped worlds, lorded over now by the single, sterile globe of obsidian that had once been St. Alina's Hope. The victory was absolute. The cost was everything. The detonation of the Principle of Yield was the final deafening punctuation mark on a war of terrible silence. In its wake, a profound, shocked stillness fell over the Viridian Veil. The Khâlsark Combine, the engine of the Great Culling, was not merely defeated, it was decapitated. Its supreme commander was unmade, its flagship atomized, and its central guiding intelligence, the final Reckoner, was a shattered crystal ghost, screaming unheard into the void. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The surviving ships of the Khâlsark fleet, their command link to Uariel severed, were suddenly and shockingly adrift. For generations, every aspect of their existence had been dictated by the cold, logical imperatives of their Ancestor Core. Now, there was only static. Hells on a dozen different vessels found themselves in command for the first time in their lives, their minds reeling from the psychic backlash of the vortex detonation, their crews in a state of shock and disarray. The great, unified machine had fractured into 100 confused and isolated parts. Panic was the first reaction. Some shipmasters, their logic compromised by fear, simply ordered their navigators to jump to the warp, fleeing the system without direction or plan, vanishing into the madness of the Empyrean. Others, driven by a sudden, primal instinct for self-preservation, turned on each other, their repurposed mining lasers firing on former comrades in a desperate scramble to seize control of vital fuel reserves or munition stores. The perfectly efficient fleet devolved into a brief, brutal civil war fought in the shadow of the world they had just murdered. The reaction of the Trans-Hyperion Alliance was different. High Call Helga Valdatir had watched the cataclysm unfold from the bridge of her flagship, the Swift Prospect, positioned at a safe distance on the system's edge. She felt no triumph, no relief. She felt only a vast, empty coldness. The lie was broken. The Wa was a fiction, and her people had been accomplices to a genocidal crusade that had ended in this obscene self-immolation. Her pragmatism, the guiding star of her entire life, had led her people to this abyss. Her orders were swift and decisive. Recall all warrior cadres. All salvage operations are terminated. Set a cordon around the blast zone, designated a void grave untouchable, and sever all contracts and communications with the remnants of the Khâlsark Combine. Log them as oathbreakers, their logic corrupted. We are done here. The Trans-Hyperion fleet, ever the professionals, disengaged with disciplined precision. They turned their backs on the shattered Khâlsark forces, offering no aid, no parting words. They had been drawn into this madness by a contract, and now, with one party to the contract annihilated, the terms were void. They would limp back to their own systems, their holds filled with the raw materials of dead worlds, their kin forever stained by the quiet complicity of their actions. They had made a profit, but the price was a wound on their honor that would never truly heal. The shattered front of the Khâlsark Combine was left to fester. The initial chaos eventually subsided, replaced by a grim, sullen new reality. From the wreckage of the command structure, a new leader emerged, not through charisma or valor, but through sheer, brutal necessity. It was Brokir Tech Lord Valen, the same kin who had negotiated the passage through the Caradriad system. His vessel, the Honest Ledger, had been far from the battle's epicenter, coordinating logistical supply lines. His mind, more augmetic than organic, had been better shielded from the psychic backlash. He was the highest-ranking officer left with a clear head. Valen did not try to rebuild the old Combine. He knew that the grand, unified vision of the final Reckoner had died with Grimdark. Instead, he imposed a new, simpler logic: survival. He rallied what ships he could, his pronouncements not of conquest, but of consolidation. He declared the Grand Viridian Prospect officially concluded. The objective, he broadcast to the fractured fleet, had been achieved: the neutralization of a sector-wide threat. The catastrophic losses were logged as acceptable operational expenditure. Under his cold mechanical guidance, the remaining Khâlsark ships began the slow, painful process of consolidating their gains. They were no longer a crusading armada, but a wounded beast retreating to its lair. They methodically gathered the vast resources they had harvested, transferring the contents of damaged haulers to intact ones. They abandoned crippled ships, stripping them for parts before leaving them to drift in the silent void. The Viridian Veil became a trail of industrial wreckage, a testament to a grand design that had shattered under the weight of its own terrible success. The front line was gone, replaced by a ragged, bleeding retreat. The war had ended, and now, the long, quiet damnation of the aftermath could truly begin. The Viridian Veil was a void of ghosts. The psychic death screams of 100 billion souls had not faded into the background hum of the war. They had coalesced, creating a persistent, discordant echo that grated on the senses of any psyker within 1,000 light-years. It was a beacon, a lighthouse of anguish and despair shining in the immaterial sea, and its baleful light had drawn hungry things from the depths. A tendril of High Fleet Leviathan, a scouting element drawn off course by this unprecedented feast of psychic energy, was the first to arrive. It was not a full fleet, merely a splinter of the Great Devourer, but it was more than enough. The Tyrannid bioships drifted into the sector, their synaptic senses overwhelmed by the banquet of residual emotion. They found a sector picked clean of all life, a table already cleared. The stripped, sterile worlds offered no biomass to consume. The vast fields of industrial wreckage and the floating metal coffins of Imperial warships were inedible. This cosmic frustration, this denial of their imperative to consume, drove the local hive mind into a state of predatory agitation. The scout fleet did not leave. It began to hunt, its vanguard organisms prowling the silent systems, seeking the source of the scent, the ones who had stolen their meal. Their hunt led them inexorably towards the retreating, resource-laden fleets of the Votann. A new war was stirring, a war not of logic or faith, but of pure, biological hunger. The second horror was homegrown. The desperate gambit on Xylos had saved the sector from the kin, but it had unleashed something far older and more patient. The planet-cracking detonation of the geothermal core had not just shattered the Forge world, it had shattered a prison 60 million years in the making. Deep beneath the Basilica Mechanicus, in a stasis crypt the Adeptus Mechanicus had mistaken for a stable geological formation, a Necron dynasty had slumbered. The planet-wide seismic shock and the raw blast of energy had triggered their awakening protocols. On the dead, floating continents of what was once Xylos, a cold, green light began to shine. Tomb complexes, their architecture a blasphemy against natural law, phased into reality from their pocket dimensions. Legions of rust-free, gleaming Necron warriors emerged from their crypts, their gauss flares powering up with a low, malevolent hum. They stepped out not onto the world they had been buried under, but into the hard vacuum of space, their living metal bodies unaffected by the void. They were the Xericon dynasty, the Silent King's own, and they awoke to find their world destroyed, their long slumber disturbed by the noisy, ephemeral creatures that now infested their galaxy. Their Pharaon, the Overlord Nezarec the Unblinking, surveyed the wreckage of his crown world with an eternity of cold fury. His directive was simple: sterilize this befouled region of space. Reclaim what was lost. Silence the squawking vermin. His gaze and the gaze of his entire unstoppable legion turned outwards towards the same Votann fleets the Tyranids now hunted. This new tripartite threat was not lost on the scattered kin. The Trans-Hyperion Alliance, retreating to their home systems, detected the Tyranid vanguard on their long-range augurs. High Khâl Valdadir realized with a sickening certainty that the psychic disturbance from the culling had painted a target on the backs of every kin in the region. They were no longer just accomplices to a genocide, they were the ones ringing the dinner bell for the Great Devourer. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Khâlsark Combine, under the tenuous leadership of Tech Lord Valen, encountered the Necrons first. A scouting party sent to salvage intact archaeotech from the Xylosian debris fields simply vanished. Then, a whole transport convoy went dark. When Valen's sensor arrays finally pinpointed the threat, the readings were so impossible, so outside of known galactic technology, that his Ironkin analysts suffered logic cascades trying to process the data. An entire, silent Necron fleet had simply appeared in their path, its crescent-shaped warships radiating an aura of temporal coldness. The whispers of these new wars began to spread through the fractured Votann fleets like a virus. The victory of the Great Culling, which had already turned to ash in their mouths, was now revealed to be the catalyst for their own potential extinction. They had culled the lesser threats of the sector, the disorganized humans and the minor Xenos races, only to inadvertently summon two of the galaxy's apex predators. The sheer, brutal irony was not lost on the pragmatic minds of the kin. They had sought to guarantee their survival by eliminating all variables, but in doing so, they had introduced two new variables of such catastrophic magnitude that their previous calculations were now rendered utterly meaningless. The Great Culling was over. The war for survival had just begun. The twin revelations of the Tyranid advance and the Necron awakening sent a shockwave of stark, undiluted terror through the surviving Votann of the sector. The grim satisfaction of the culling curdled into the bitter bile of self-recrimination. They were trapped. To their fore, the implacable, silent legions of the Xericon dynasty, intent on scouring them from existence for the crime of trespassing. To their AFT, the predatory, slavering vanguard of Hive Fleet Leviathan, drawn by the psychic stench of their great sin. They were caught between the unfeeling metal fist of the past and the ravenous organic maw of the future. In this crucible of impending doom, the old divisions and bitter recriminations between the leagues became unsustainable luxuries. High Call Helga Valdaughter of the Trans-Hyperion Alliance, her fleets the most intact, found herself facing a decision that would define the fate of her people. She could abandon the Khâlsark remnants to their fate, using her fleet's superior speed to flee the sector and preserve her own kin. It was the logical, self-interested choice. But her augurs showed the Tyranid splinter fleet was not merely chasing the Khâlsark, it was spreading a net of biological horrors that would soon threaten her own home systems. Running was not a permanent solution. Tech Lord Valen, acting commander of the broken Khâlsark Combine, reached out to her. His message was not an apology or a plea. It was a cold, pragmatic proposal, stripped of all emotion, a continuation of the same terrible logic that had begun the war. He transmitted a full unredacted copy of the final Reckoner's core prognostications, including the data that predicted the rise of the Tyranids and the eventual reawakening of the Necrons. He demonstrated that URL had foreseen these threats, but had calculated that they would not manifest for another 5 millennia. The Great Culling, he argued, was not the cause of this new crisis, but its timeline had been catastrophically accelerated by unforeseen events. The Vortex Grenade, the destruction of Xylos's core. His argument was simple. The original calculation remains valid. The survival of the kin is paramount. We possess the resources of 100 worlds. You possess the fleet. A new venture is required. The Viridian Sector Annihilation Compact. Valdaughter. Faced with the undeniable truth of the dual threats and the cold hard logic of Valen's proposal, saw only one viable path. Survival demanded consolidation. She convened an emergency council with the calls of 2 other smaller leagues who had territory nearby the stoic Umar Pride hegemony and the mercantile Sarantok conglomerate. Showing them the data from both Valen and her own augurs, she laid out the terrible choice. They could stand divided on principle and be consumed one by one, or they could unite in damnation and fight. The consolidation of the damned took place in the Dead System, where St. Alina's Hope had once been a jewel. The fleets of the 4 leagues met amidst the floating debris and the ghostly echoes of the war. There were no grand ceremonies, no oaths of brotherhood. It was a grim, tense gathering, a meeting of survivors pooling their assets before the storm. The vast holds of the Khâlsark haulers, filled with the processed wealth of the culling, were opened. The raw materials were distributed amongst the leagues, used to repair ships, rearm weapons, and forge new warplate. The Sarantok conglomerate, masters of trade and industry, oversaw the distribution with ruthless efficiency, their price a full share of the compact's authority. The Umar Pride, whose fleets were known for their nigh-impenetrable void shields, took up the forward defensive positions, their pride forcing them to take the post of greatest danger. The Khâlsark fleets, depleted and leaderless, were absorbed wholesale into the other commands. Their advanced, horrific processing technology was shared. Their Ironkin legions reprogrammed and integrated. Tech Lord Valen, his purpose served, willingly ceded command to Valdatir, stepping down to become the chief of logistics and strategy for the new unified fleet. He was a creature of pure function, and his function now was to advise, not to lead. High Cull Valdaughter became the de facto leader of this new monstrous alliance. She stood on the bridge of the swift prospect and watched as the disparate fleets coalesced into a single, massive armada. They were no longer the Trans-Hyperion Alliance or the Khâlsark Combine. They were simply the kin of the Veil, a new and terrible power forged in the crucible of genocide and desperation. Their first act as a unified force was not to flee, but to turn and fight. Valdatir, using the Trans-Hyperion's advanced sensor data, identified the path of the nearest Necron Outrider fleet. She knew they could not outrun both threats forever. They had to send a message. They had to prove that the kin were not merely prey. She laid a trap in the asteroid field that had once been the planet Lasthenius. Using the scrap metal of the Hive world, they constructed a field of sensor ghosts and false energy readings. When the Necron fleet entered the field, the combined Votann armada sprung their ambush. The battle was unlike any they had fought before. The Necron ships were unnervingly resilient, their living metal hulls repairing damage almost instantaneously. But the kin had the advantage of numbers and desperation. They unleashed the repurposed industrial weapons of the Great Culling planet crackers that buckled reality, laser drills that sliced through Necron cruisers, and gravitic tractors that pulled smaller Necron ships into the paths of asteroids. They won. They destroyed the Necron fleet, but the cost was staggering. They lost a fifth of their newly consolidated force. But it was a victory, a statement. They had looked into the abyss of extinction and spat in its face. As the green lights of the last Necron vessel died, a grim, ferocious resolve settled over the united Votann fleet. They had started this war to secure their future through logic. Now, they would continue it through sheer, bloody-minded spite. The Great Culling had failed, but its horrific purpose had been reborn. They would continue to harvest, to strip, to consume, not for a calculated future, but for the desperate, immediate need to fuel their new, endless war against the true horrors of the galaxy they themselves had awakened. The Viridian Veil, as a name on a chart, ceased to exist. To the administratum of the Imperium, it was a sector lost, a black mark in the annals of Segmentum Pacificus, written off as a casualty of some unknown Xenos cataclysm. To the Votann, who had bled and murdered their way across its breadth, it was now designated Primary Resource Zone EAR. It was no longer a place of stars and worlds, but a vast, silent factory, a testament to a calculation that had spiraled into a nightmare of endless war. The legacy of the Great Culling was one of profound and terrible transformation. The kin who survived were not the same people who had entered the Veil. The pragmatism that had been their defining trait had calcified into a monolithic, galaxy-spanning paranoia. The lesson they had learned was not that their logic was flawed, but that it had not been ruthless enough. They had sought to secure their future and had instead mortgaged it to an eternity of conflict. Their solution, therefore, was to double down. Under the unified command of High Khâl Helga Valdaughter, the newly forged Votann Compact became a terrifying new power in the galactic east. They were no longer prospectors or traders. They were predators, a nomadic, industrial war host that moved from system to system, stripping worlds not for long-term prosperity, but for the immediate, desperate need to fuel their ongoing war against the Necrons and Tyranids. Every planet was assessed for its strategic value. Those with high biomass were rendered down to feed the vat-grown clone vats that replaced their endless casualties. Those with high mineral wealth were pulverized to forge new ships and munitions. Civilizations, human or Xenos, were not even considered an obstacle anymore. They were simply the topsoil that had to be cleared to get to the resources beneath. The legend born from this war was not one of heroes, but of a damned people and their cold, unforgiving leader. Khâl Urthane Grimdark was remembered not as a monster, but as a pioneer, a visionary, whose only flaw was in underestimating the scale of the task. High Khâl Valdaughter, the leader who had been deceived into complicity, became his grim successor. She did not rule with Grimdark's dispassionate logic, but with a bitter, weary fury. She was the matriarch of a damned race, and she would see them survive, no matter the cost in souls, their own or others. The balance of power in the galaxy shifted in a subtle but profound way. A new faction had emerged, one that played by no rules but its own survival. They were a threat unlike any other. They did not seek to convert like the Tau, or to enslave like the Drukhari, or to simply kill for the sake of it like the Orc. They sought only to convert the galaxy into fuel, a dispassionate, industrial hunger that was, in its own way, as terrifying as the biological consumption of the Tyranids. The most insidious legacy, however, was not the fleet, but the idea. The redacted data of the final Reckoner's calculation, the core logic of the Great Culling, had been disseminated among the Allied Leagues. Tech Lord Valen, in his new role as chief strategist, saw to it. He believed that the only way to ensure the kin's ultimate survival was for all leagues to eventually accept the brutal truth that UREL had uncovered. Whispers of the final Reckoner's logic began to spread on encrypted data streams across the Votann's galactic network. The story of the Viridian Veil was told not as a cautionary tale, but as a proof of concept. The Khâlsark Combine had failed, yes, but they had also succeeded in acquiring resources beyond the dreams of any other league, resources that were now the only thing standing between the kin of the Veil and total extinction. Across the galaxy, in the silent humming hearts of 1,000 other Votann fleets, other Ancestor Cores began to stir. They received the fragmented data of URER's final calculation. They analyzed the resource yields of the Great Culling against the casualty rates. They factored in the new, undeniable threats of the Necrons and Tyranids. And in the cold, unfeeling silence of their crystalline minds, many began to run the numbers for themselves. They began to wonder. They began to calculate. They began to ask if URER had not been a mad prophet of doom, but simply the first to be brave enough or broken enough to see the one true, terrible path to survival in a merciless galaxy that had no place for them. The Great Culling was over, but the age of the Votann as the galaxy's most efficient monsters was just beginning.